Dr. Ridden, would you say that the Torah Shabbal Peh is can be looked at, and this is in accordance with what Bar-Hayim has said in the name of Rav Kook regarding the Torah Shabbal Peh, that the Torah Shabbal Peh is whereby the Jewish people synergize with the Torah Shebichtav, or at least the scholars there of the Jewish people. Would you be willing to accept the idea that perhaps the Torah Shabbal Peh is the mechanism by which we juice the Torah for meaning, both by using hermeneutical principles and by taking into account newly learned realities as you described?
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is some truth to that. That you look at the activity Chazal were engaged in, and it was about saying, how can we read the Torah with sincerity as being given to us from the hand of Hashem, but where we have to understand what it means given the world we see ourselves to inhabit. I think there are different versions of this kind of an account that appeal more or less, meaning sometimes you hear a maybe slightly more um I don't know, I'm looking for the right word, that it's an account as though from the perspective of a dispassionate historian who sometimes tries to make up a, I think, not necessarily plausible, just so story of the history of the development of uh, Jewish thought and jurisprudence, where there's this idea somehow that, well, originally we just had the written Torah, and that kind of was, not really practicable. And then the genius of, the rabbis was to figure out that they could more or less pave over it and rewrite it with all of their creativity. And they came up with something that was much more workable. Obviously, someone who's telling the story in that way, which you do here, is telling it from the outside and trying to look at the development of the Judaic practice of Torah as though it's sort of an anthropological story that they're telling, and one in which there isn't any kind of um, foresight or authority that we're granting to Hakadosh Baruch Hu in the development of that whole process, but we're more just sort of almost crediting the rabbis with like fixing the Torah, and chas v'chalila. And I don't think that's what um, it makes sense to say. And really, I think when people express an attitude such as that, it's usually from the standpoint of not being familiar enough with the ingenious synergy between the tradition of interpretation we have from Chazal and the written Torah itself. Like, you can't really imagine them separate from each other. Um, it is uh, very much like observing two parts of a living whole working together when you study both of them and see them working in concert. And I don't think it's plausible to think of Torah Shebal Peh as though it's this late edition that people realized they had to put on as a patch afterwards because the written one, you know, had too many deficiencies or something like that. Um, but if you go more over into just saying, looking at what Chazal are doing, that they're kind of demonstrating a technique that maybe we should see as in some sense an invitation to us to engage in similar kinds of interpretations, and that's something we have to do with care, obviously, because the question of authority and who's doing this with sufficient knowledge and sufficient sincerity and all of those kinds of criteria that must apply when someone is doing something that really could change the weight of a law on people's shoulders. um that's obviously something that has to be handled very delicately, but I do think that the ingenuity Chazal show in midrashim, and also in their innovations in halacha, what it's it's trying to demonstrate that this is really a much more living process, and it's one that we can certainly think of as still being available to us. Like the Torah is for everyone, as the Torah says, it's for the wood chopper and the water bearer, right? Like it's for all the people, and it's not a secret religion that sort of is held beyond reach, from us to not understand and not delve into. But I would also say that I think maybe the point I'm making is slightly, or additionally different, in that, at least from our perspective now, there's a whole lot about the Torah as a whole where, in order to know what it means, we look at both Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh. We look at Ayin Tachat Ayin, and we look at what Chazal say about Ayin Tachat Ayin, and they tell us that it's a doctrine of financial compensation, and it's not really about gouging out people's eyes. And we get that all as a package deal, and we learn from that. And in that particular example, I'm not sure that you could say that it was the sort of hard-earned lessons of experience or the progress of scientific knowledge that somehow allowed Chazal to take Ayin Tachat Ayin and figure out what it meant necessarily. Because to some degree, we really trace some of the knowledge of what the Torah means through Chazal back to Moshe. And so there's a different issue there, which is that just the meaning of any of these words was something we had to have a tradition for at the outset. That was partly an oral tradition. And this is expressed in this famous Gemara where Rabbi Akiva is asked by a goy to teach him the Torah shebichtav without the Torah shebal peh, and he sort of teaches him the Aleph Bet backwards and demonstrates to him that, if you don't have an oral tradition, you can't even read the Torah. And sorry, it wasn't Rabbi Akiva, it was Hillel, right? That's these are in the pairs of stories with Hillel and Shammai, where there are these different people trying to convert, including the more famous one was standing on one leg. So this was Hillel. But I think the idea I'm arguing for may be more in the realm of it may partly apply to some of what Chazal taught, in the sense that there's also an aspect of what the Torah means that is perhaps in some ways specific to the experience and knowledge and understanding of the generation that's trying to keep it, right? Like Talmud Bavli is not the same as Talmud Yerushalmi in a variety of respects, one of which is that Talmud Bavli talks a lot more about demons and astrology. And the reason it does that is because they were in Bavel, and demons and astrology were in the drinking water in Bavel, so to speak. Like you couldn't talk about what the world was and the way it worked in Bavel without invoking those ideas, because that was the science of the time, or that was like the best people felt they could understand about how everything hung together and why things happened. And you get a lot less of that in Talmud Yerushalmi, because that was not as much the way of talking about what the world was and how it worked in Eretz Yisrael. And so it may be that exactly what Chazal had to say about demons, there may be some interesting lessons to learn if you look for the right kind of more universal message there. But it may also be that we don't really need to be as expert about demons and astrology as Chazal might have been. But there are some things that we are expert about in our place and time where we need to understand better what the Torah's relevance is to those things. And the emunah that we need to have is to look in the Torah and say, I know this came from Hashem, and I know that it does have the ability to sort of have its parameters trained, so to speak, by my experience and by my knowledge of the world and what it is, to guide me in the right way. And I'm going to trust that the framework that it provides is the correct one. And then I'm going to kind of take what I know and say, okay, well, now that I know that there's such a thing as a nuclear weapon or whatever, what does the Torah have to tell me about that? And only because you have the faith to understand that Hashem gave you the Torah, and you have the current moment, in history, that you're a part of, where there's such a thing as nuclear weapons. Do you have that kind of question that you can ask? And it wasn't, the same kind of question that someone else could ask reading the Torah 1,000 years ago, and 1,000 years from now they'll have other questions. But I think that aspect of it may be something that is almost uniquely more our job in this world and in this time, to get to work on.
I think when you're talking about halacha as being the anchor which ensures that a given interpreter is acting within the proper parameters, another way of putting that perhaps is being anchored in Yirat Shamayim, in fear of heaven.
Right. And that, I guess maybe that pertains to the well, I mean, you may be referencing, is it, I know there's a pasuk from David in Tehillim and one from Shlomo and Mishlei that are very similar, where it's about Reshit Chochmah, or like the beginning of wisdom is, in one case, is it Yirat Hashem, and in the other case, it's a similar concept, but maybe not exactly the same. I'd have to try to dig them up, but so yes, I think that ultimately we, in order to have the right process of refining our understanding of the Torah, we clearly are not going to succeed without the proper Yirat Hashem, because what that Yirah amounts to in that process, right? What awe before Hashem is about, is being willing to be defeated by his authority. And that is essential in any process of coming to a text and trying to give an interpretation to it, where you're going to come up with some chidush, right? If you're going to make some innovation in terms of what it means, that's the most dangerous thing in the world, if there's nothing that would stop you, right? Like that you wouldn't balk at any innovation as long as it appeals to you and your intellect and your preferences and your desire. What you need is to be anchored in some concept of course, I only want to do what Hashem wants me to do. I want to figure out what that is. And if you with sincerity believe that there is such a thing, that's what he wants you to do, and that you might initially, when you realize it, recoil from that and say, I don't know if I like that, or I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, I don't know if I agree with that, and yet I have to do it and I have to accept it because it actually is the law. It comes from him and it's not for me to choose. That needs to be the fundamental attitude. And if you can maintain that kavanah in the course of the interpretive exploration, then that can anchor you in a way that will ultimately guide you along a path, perhaps to a discovery of something that Hashem means, that does require your insight and your creativity and your introduction of a new perspective into the meaning of something. I think the pasuk we were looking for before was Reshit Chochma Yirat Adonai Sechel Tov Lechol Osehem Tehirato Omedet Le'ad. The fear of Hashem is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever. That's the one from Tehillim. So it's David. And then in Mishlei you have Reshit Chochma Kne Chochma Uvechol Keninecha Kene Vina. And then there's also Yirat Adonai Reshit Da'at Chochma Umusar Ewelim Bazu. So that's the fear of Hashem is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Slightly different.
There's also at the end of Kohelet, the very end of Kohelet, some, if I'm not mistaken, some pasuk which says something about the bottom line is that the only thing that matters is
A soft
fearing
davar, right? Like,
something like that. Yeah, I don't remember the exact wording.
let's see. סוף דבר הכל נשמע את האלוהים יראה ואת מצוותיו שמור כי זה כל האדם. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.